Alrighty, we'll let the attendees file in. Hi everyone, welcome. We're just going to give it a few minutes for more people to file in. So we'll start around 12:05. All right, everyone, we'll give it just 2 more minutes for any last bit of people trickling in. Thank you for coming and celebrating Earth Week with us. This is the last day, so I'm glad you guys could make it. Again, we'll start in about 1 more minute. All right, so it's 12:05. And so again, I'd like to say thank you for everyone who is here in our Earth Week 2020 celebration, brought to you by the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School, Marine Science Graduate Student Organizations, Sustainability Initiatives, Earth Week Committee. It's a mouthful, but we really, regardless of the current situation going on, we really wanted to still provide a community experience for everyone, you know, to come together, celebrate Earth Week, maybe learn some new things, gain new perspectives. What we would like to remind everyone is that this is a positive community experience. That kind of means there's no troll zone. That means anyone who is not being respectful can and will be dismissed without warning, right? So I think something awesome that I learned this week is don't challenge people, challenge ideas. So be respectful in the meantime, okay? So again, a positive community experience for our very last Eco Eats. Today we're talking about climate change and policy, and we have two very bright PhD students and candidates, one from the University of Miami, one from FIU. So with that being said, our first speaker today is Greg Koman. He is a PhD candidate in meteorology and physical oceanography, and I will let him take it over from here.
Great, thanks, Kayla. I assume people can hear me. Awesome. Okay, let me just share my screen. Yeah, I'm gonna, unless Kayla gets on and says something's wrong, I'm gonna assume people can see my screen now. And so thank you so much for putting this together for the Rasmus or Rosenstiel School's sustainability group. And Kayla in particular, I know has been spearheading this, and she's been working pretty tirelessly. So really appreciate putting this all together, despite the fact that we're all kind of locked in our apartments and homes and so on. So as Kayla mentioned, my name is Greg. And what I want to talk about today is something that I call the most powerful solution against climate change. You know, we talk a lot about all the different things that we can do to try to prevent climate change from happening, or the worst effects of it. And for me, when I discovered this solution, it made so much sense to me as the thing that stood out the most, that can make the greatest impact. So without further ado, I'll start my presentation. And I'm going to start by saying that, you know, a little bit of my background. When I decided to start my PhD a number of years ago, and the impetus behind it was that I realized that we have this, you know, kind of once in a lifetime experience happening to us right now in terms of what's happening to our planet and the climate. And I felt as though I wanted to be a solution to that. And so I changed.
I don't think you're sharing your screen yet, actually.
Oh, okay. Let me see.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm happy you did. Like I said, I'd assumed somebody would, okay. Is it there?
Not quite.
I'm hitting share screen.
Try hitting the share and then.
Let me see. Share computer sound optimizing. Let me see if this does it at all. Open systems.
So at the bottom where you have the Q&A and the share, can you hit the share screen button?
Yeah, that I did. And let me see, portion of screen.
Click. Yeah, so if you click share screen and then go to, you should be able to do PowerPoint.
Okay, let me see. Okay, yeah, I think I just it's closing PowerPoint and opening it back up again. Sorry, we always got technical issues.
Oh yeah, we've all been here for sure.
Okay, let's see if I can, let me try opening it again. It's booting back up. Hopefully this works. If not, my wife does a million Zoom conference calls every day, and I can grab her and she'll probably be able to figure it out in a second. Let's see. Okay, so I've opened PowerPoint back up again. I'll try clicking share screen. Okay. Are you seeing anything? Are you seeing my face or?
We see your face, yeah.
Okay. Well, what about?
Now we can't hear you.
Give me 1 second.
All right, I think what we should do is, Nadia, would you like to go first and go ahead and share your screen?
Oh, great. Now my camera doesn't want to start. What is happening? Okay.
All right, so change of plans. We're just gonna have Nadia go first while Greg works out his technical difficulties. I'm pretty sure we all can be a little forgiving. It's kind of a crazy time and Zoom is kind of complicated. So
Yeah. Also, so I had this happen to me last week. I wanted to say if he has another monitor on, it might show up on the other monitor instead of what he's showing. So do you want to maybe wait for 2 seconds for that, or you just proceed?
oh, just go ahead and charge forward and then we'll have Greg work it out behind scenes.
Okay, sounds good. All right, hopefully there's no issue with me sharing my screen. Okay. Is that working?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
All right. Go ahead.
Let's do it. All right, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. As Kayla mentioned, my name is Nadia Seeteram, and I'm a PhD student at FIU in the Department of Earth and Environment. I'd like to, of course, start by thanking both Colleen Brown and Kayla Ann for inviting me here to participate. I think this is such an incredible event and just a really great way to stay connected, through these times. So just to give a bit of background on myself, I am very interested in understanding the inequalities that are inherent in sea level rise and how that affects different communities, especially as it concerns migration and displacement. So this topic of climate gentrification is an issue that I am working through right now in my dissertation research, but I'm also really interested in understanding governance and how it seeks to sort of build resilience in communities and what that means. So I'm not actually going to be presenting on any actual research of mine right now, but I'm hopefully going to provide a little bit of context about what climate gentrification is, what are the types of things that we need to be thinking through as we consider some of these issues moving forward. So before we get into the topic of climate gentrification, I'd like to start first by actually thinking through what is just gentrification. And I think it's really important to start with a definition of that, because for those of us who've been living in urban environments, I think that, we've been at least sort of hearing this word gentrification or dealing with it in some shape or form for the past decade, probably even before that. But it kind of makes it seem like it's a new emerging trend. But gentrification's been around actually quite for some decades. It was coined first in the academic literature in 1964 to describe changes in a community in London. And so we don't really have a stable definition of gentrification. It's really changed through time. But for the most part, most definitions of gentrification really seek to characterize the socioeconomic change that happens in a community when an influx of residents who usually have a higher socioeconomic status relative to the residents who were living in the area before, when they move into an area, the changes that sort of come with them. And those changes include rises in, rising property values, rising rents, perhaps even changes in culture as amenity values change. And so in Miami, we are really no stranger to gentrification. From the time period of 2000 to 2015, Miami has experienced an overall growth of around 17%. A lot of that growth has taken place in the downtown area, where the population has increased about 193%, and the amount of households has increased about 261% from that time period. And that really reflects the apartment and condominium building boom. Of note is the fact that a lot of this construction is dictated by foreign investment. So So we have a very interesting housing market here, and that foreign investment dictates a lot of the ongoing construction here. In the same time period, what we're actually also seeing is that the affordable housing stock is sort of dipping below 20%. And another point of, that we should just make a note of is that in the state of Florida, there is no rent control. In other states, there are ways to sort of protect affordable housing, but here in Florida, most of the housing stock that is deemed affordable housing is actually considered naturally occurring affordable housing. So that's just, normal market conditions. And so, when we think about what climate gentrification means or what climate change means in this context, if you're not really, if your conceptualization of climate change doesn't include climate change as a risk multiplier or a stress amplifier, I really want you to leave this presentation in sort of thinking about that. We have an incredible amount of pressure on affordable housing here in Florida. We have many rent-stressed households, and so climate change really will continue to place pressure on an already existing pressure. And so in that sense, we can think of climate gentrification as gentrification that is prompted by the impacts of climate change. And the picture that you see in the background are some activists in Little Haiti, which is the community that is really at the center of this emerging topic. Over the last 5 or 7 years, they've been, perhaps even more, they've been really the rallying cry for highlighting what they think is ongoing in their neighborhood, which happens to be a neighborhood of higher elevation, in which they are seeing developers speculate and buy land in their neighborhood as a way to sort of mitigate their risk from coastal properties that might have more flooding. So that's a lot. I'm gonna unpack that all very slowly. So let's start with what is the actual threat here. It comes as no surprise to many of you that Miami-Dade County is exceptionally vulnerable to sea level rise. By some estimates, we have around $280 to $400 billion worth of exposed assets to flooding. We have about 2.7 million people living in the county. And so it really holds serious implications for our ability to live here long term. And so the graph that you see in front of you is the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact's projections for sea level rise. I'd like to call your attention just for the next decade up until 2030. It is projected on the high end that we might see about 12 inches or at least 1 foot of sea level rise in the next 10 years. And these numbers were produced in 2015. There has since been an update in 2019, but the full draft isn't available. But we do have some preliminary numbers, but unfortunately they only just show an acceleration of the trends that we have projected. And so what does this mean for South Florida? Well, a few different things. It means we can expect an increase in extreme level events. No surprise to anyone, we are in the path of Atlantic hurricanes, and so there's a certain amount of probability that those occur every year. That brings about storm-related flooding, more intense storm surges. In the last few years, we've seen an increase in the frequency of high tide and sunny day flooding. I'm sure some of you are really familiar with that, but it's pictured here. And it is what we call nuisance flooding because it very much so is a nuisance. This is not regular freshwater flooding. This is saltwater flooding. It corrodes, it damages cars, bikes, corrodes drainage infrastructure, streets. And so we have seen an uptake in the frequency of those events, though this is also an emerging area of research. And of course, we have to deal with permanent inundation because that sea level rise itself will eventually over time just continue will inundate areas. Another thing of note is this is not just a coastal issue here in Miami. This is both an inland and coastal problem. So this is a FEMA FEMA flood zone map. And what's really interesting about the map, I think, for the map makers here, is that they didn't actually make quite a big distinguish. They didn't really try to distinguish very well in their legend. So even though these have different flood zone designations, but what you can see here is really well is the Atlantic coastal ridge, which runs up the southeast coast of Florida, and it is also some of the higher elevated areas of the county. And so because of our porous geology, this sea level rise issue is not going to stay a coastal issue. It becomes an inland one as well. And so in 2018, Jesse Keenan was the first person to, put some empirical data behind, this concept of climate gentrification. And he, found empirical evidence for price appreciation of single family homes on increments of higher elevation. I should actually go back for a second. The idea behind that is that people who are living in areas of these lower lying areas will eventually want to move to these higher elevated areas. And that is the first pathway that he articulates, called the superior investment pathway. Essentially what he's saying is that Miami Beach at some point will become too high risk to, or at least homeowners on an individual level, renters, developers will sort of make that decision that Miami Beach or places like Miami Beach are too high risk, and they'll want to move to these lower risk geographies or these higher elevated areas like Little Haiti. On that same note, over time as sea level rise progresses, the state might also want to incentivize development on those higher elevated areas, sort of promote densification on those areas as a way to become more resilient. If the high risk flooding areas become too high risk, there's really not much point in spending millions and billions of public money on investments in those areas. And so there at some point might be a shift to those higher elevated areas, which again exacerbates that housing pressure. And that's called the resilient investment pathway. Those are the ones that I think are most relevant for the Miami context. And to give some perspective on what does this sort of look like at the individual level, who are these individuals, homeowners, what are they seeing? If they're, what is their experience like to sort of make a decision that might prompt movement? Well, one of the active areas of research is really thinking through, barring a major hurricane event, these high tide nuisance floodings are the actual, are more of a present reality for some of these coastal areas. And so this map shows a collection of data points from citizen scientists from the FIU Sea Level Solutions Center Day. This event has been going on for 3 years, and I hope it is able to continue this year because it's an amazing way for us to both engage the community and collect data at the same time. So all of these data points here reflect areas of flooding. And so we train people to sort of go out, take salinity measurements, take depth measurements, take some fecal coliform measurements, and also, we tag a geolocation to the areas of flooding. And this is one way for us to sort of understand just how frequent these events are. And so these data points up here in Hollywood, well, that's where I was last October. And so you can see here, I'm covered in about 13 feet of floodwater. I spoke to a lot of people that day in Hollywood, people who had, floodwater encroaching on their grass, clearly not not taking into consideration their sign, encroaching on their cars. I also observed water coming up through cracks, which I thought was really interesting because usually the water comes through drainage outlets or sewer or manhole covers, things like that. But it was really interesting to see water also bubbling up from the cracks. And so this is the day-to-day experience of people, again, barring a major hurricane event, barring major coastal flooding events, this is really what they're facing in terms of frequency and a daily reminder of rising seas. And so the idea behind Jesse Keenan's paper is what he was testing was this nuisance hypothesis. Will individual homeowners, will renters, will developers, will they eventually just realize this no longer is the best investment and try to move to these higher elevated areas? The problem with that is that there are already people living in these areas. There are whole communities that have rich histories here in Miami who are seeing the cultural erasure of their communities. This is a picture of activists within Little Haiti protesting the Magic City development. This is Marlene Bastien. She is a prominent figure in Little Haiti. And I think what is also of note in the climate gentrification context is, this isn't just gentrification that occurs because of market conditions. It is an amplification of something because of the result of, of rising seas, which gets back to global emissions, which has a whole history of a whole justice element to this. And then when you take into consideration the history of the communities that are already living there that might be displaced, it adds just a whole other element. But that's exactly what we're about to do. So let's take steps all the way back to 1986 when the city of Miami was first incorporated. The story of Miami does not begin actually with the arrival of Cuban immigrants. It begins with the arrival of a different set of immigrants from the Bahamas and the migration of Southern Blacks down to Miami to seek opportunity in Magic City. They were seeking jobs, building Henry Flagler's railroad or as agricultural labor. But when they got to Miami, they realized that, Magic City was only for a certain set of people. And so this is really the Jim Crow era of Miami. What you're looking at here is a picture from the 1920s of the slums in what was then known as Colored Town, what is now known as Overtown. It depicts a picture that is very different from the shiny, beautiful beaches of Miami. It is overcrowded. It is poorly constructed shotgun homes, very humid weather, no sanitation. And this was the reality of many Black communities in Miami at this time. Some Bahamian immigrants did settle in West Grove, but for the most part, most people, most Black communities were through a series of policies, we're living in what was then called the Central Negro District. It was very close to the Central Business District, but if you sort of notice from these pictures, you can see the huge difference in densification in this area as opposed to the other areas outside it. And the reason for this is, keeping Black communities in this area was a means of wealth extraction. Wealth extraction from predominantly white landowners. And what I mean by that is the people who were living in these communities were kept in a cycle of poverty and debt that allowed for extreme wealth accumulations from people like George Merrick, who Merrick Park is named after. And what I mean by extreme wealth accumulation is, well, for example, profit margins for rental housing in the rest of Miami was around it was expected to have around a 7 or 8% return at this period. But within the slums of Overtown, that profit margin was around 27%. So this is a period that really, cements a lot of discriminatory policy that was further cemented, I think, by the federal government. In 1933, as part of the New Deal, the National Housing Act established the Federal Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The idea behind the Federal Housing Authority was to really try to boost the economy by providing federally backed insurance for home mortgages. And while discrimination was not written into the law, in practice, it was discriminatory. African American communities were not allowed to obtain federally insured home mortgages. At the same time, the FHA backed the construction of more slum rental housing, so to really just continue that cycle. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation was the institution that designed the neighborhood security maps that you see over here. Essentially what it designated were areas that were suitable for lending. So these blue and green areas were suitable for lending. These red areas here were not. And this is where that term redlining comes from. And this is where the American communities primarily were made to sort of live here. These, if you can see a bit, this is where Overtown would be. And then construction for slum rental housing also started, and public housing as well, also started up here in Liberty City around this time. This is something that did not just occur in Miami. This occurred across the United States, and some scholars really contend that that the Federal Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation were the public institutions that were just incredibly responsible for solidifying housing inequality and all the subsequent inequality of outcomes that have come from that exist today. But by the 1960s, there was a push to clear slums, and there was a push for slum clearance, and as a result of the construction of the interstate highway system. And so in 1960, the construction of I-95 in Miami began, and it cut right through Overtown, displacing about 18,000 people. There were originally 40,000 people living in Overtown at the time. Now there are only 10,000. And so, as you can see, the highway just cuts right through there. Many people were forced to relocate without any government assistance at all. So this is Overtown pre-I-95. Again, you can really tell that just by looking at the densification of the homes here in comparison to the other places on this map. And then this is Overtown in the 1990s. Again, you can see that the highway just runs right through it. And so for reference, Overtown is here, right now, sort of next to the Miami River, and many of the people who were forced to relocated here to Liberty City, where there already was quite a bit of public housing that was constructed here as well. And then in the 80s, when the wave of Haitian immigrants came, they also settled right next door. Over here. The reason I point this map out is not just for reference, but this map actually shows elevation. And so the areas in pink here, everything that you see in pink represents about 9 feet of elevation, which for those of us who live in Miami know that's quite a bit of elevation. And everything in blue shows anything really below 9 feet approximately. And if you look carefully, you can see that a bunch of these pink areas are here in Little Haiti, in Liberty City, cutting through parts of Alapata, Overtown, Wynwood, Edgewater. These are already really gentrified areas. And then again, getting it here into Little Havana. The reason I call out those neighborhoods is because with Apalaca, which is not featured on this map, these neighborhoods hold about more than 80% of the very low income to low to moderate income households in Miami. These are neighborhoods with very high proportion of renters. They have below average rent. Again, this is not rent that is protected either. These are what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. And so preserving that is really, really critical for these families to continue to live here. However, they also coincide with some of the higher elevated areas in Miami, which is which again presents this problem with climate gentrification, especially as plans for making Miami resilient in the light of sea level rise actually do focus on building on the Atlantic coastal ridge, those high elevation areas. And so this is a slide taken from an Urban Land Institute presentation that really hopes to focus transit-oriented development, that's TOD, by densifying on the ridge. And in this presentation, it sort of does call out that you need to preserve existing affordable housing and be sensitive to potential displacement pressure. But my question to you is, well, how do we do that if the protections are not there and if they're not immediately made made legal. And so if this is the vision of Miami for the next coming decades, and the way that we deal with sea level rise, yes, it's incredibly beautiful, but we need to sort of ask ourselves, you know, who will be resilient in Miami as when we take into consideration changes with sea level rise. And so that's a question that I'd like to leave you with today, and I'd be happy to take your questions now. I think I'm gonna stop sharing, right, Kayla?
Does anyone have questions? We can let some trickle in too, and if you get any, you can feel free to, you know, type in there or answer them after Greg is done too.
Okay, yeah, sounds great.
That was,
thank you so much.
oh yeah, see, some are still processing, so we can do it afterwards. That was so powerful. That was a great presentation. So when I give my climate change talks, usually at the end, because climate change can be a little doomsday, right? And so at the end, I usually like to say, well, Miami's a resilient city. We'll bounce back. You know, will we ever really be underwater? It's like, oh, but don't worry. We'll be just, instead of like the gondolas, like in Italy, we'll be on our jet skis skiing around. But I guess now the question should be, who can have a jet ski? You know?
Absolutely, that's exactly the question.
So that was very powerful. I do think you have some questions.
Oh, great. Okay. So I just answer them out loud. Great. So processing. What are some of the current projects aimed at protecting low-income housing? So right now there are a lot of plans being developed in Miami, and FIU in collaboration with the city of Miami has recently put out an affordable housing master plan. So that is something that they are actively exploring. I don't know how it connects though to the other plans that are being released, like Resilient 305, which is specifically for climate resilience in Miami-Dade County. So these are questions that we really need to be asking, you know, how are they making these connections? It's great to have an affordable housing master plan. There are lots of great things in there, but how does it connect to this issue of sea level rise specifically? Do you have a vision of sea level rise or other types of resiliency for Miami that takes into account marginalized communities? So I'm not really interested in my vision. I think for my research, I'm really interested in the vision of the communities who will be affected. That is something that I hope to actively explore in my work, so please stay tuned. How will influxes of climate refugees from abroad affect climate gentrification in Miami? I think that's a fascinating question. Yeah, I'm not sure, because we are such a hub for people who are still immigrating to this country, and those influxes have to be considered as we move. I think a lot of the questions thus far have been focused on where will we go in Miami. A lot of research, especially by Matt Hauer, has sort of suggested that people might be moving to Orlando or Atlanta, Georgia, so you might want to check that out, but I think that's a fantastic question. Oh, and there is a wonderful link to the Housing Solutions Lab. I have a lot of information from my, the picture of the redlining map is from their website. So please check that out. It is an incredible resource.
Alrighty, that was so good. Thank you so much, Nadia.
Great,
I think too, another super powerful thing, I've never seen a video of the water actually coming up through the cracks.
Yeah, me too. That was really, really crazy.
That is like, we have, like, even as climate scientists, we have seen the projections, we know the sea level rise, we know the facts, but actually seeing it come up through the cracks for the first time, yeah, that's gonna be in my mind for a while.
I know, I really think I should be forwarding that video to city engineers in Broward County.
Yeah, I think Broward County might be, needs a lot more focus too, so
Definitely.
not just Miami. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
All right, we're gonna shift back over to Greg, who's gonna tell us, who is gonna share about the importance of the carbon tax and how, you know, paying attention to these types of things can, in the long run, help connect back to some of the things that Nadia is talking about, right? So how that can impact everyone as a whole by doing your part, such as voting. So, Greg, do you want to get in there?
Yeah, let's try it again. I'm going to share my screen. And if you could just confirm that you see PowerPoint, my PowerPoint presentation in a moment. Share. Let's see. And do you see it right now?
Woo!
All right.
Yay.
Take two.
All right, take it away.
Yeah, so as Kayla mentioned, I'm going to be talking about something that, people say carbon tax, and what I'm actually going to talk about is something called a fee and dividend. I'll explain in a moment. But it's important to note that people hear the word tax and they immediately are like, forget it. I don't want anything like that. It's important to note that what I'm going to be talking about today and promoting is something that is a fee in the sense that the government doesn't keep it, but actually takes all the money and gives it back to the citizens equally. But I'll talk about that in a moment. So my presentation is called Unlocking the Most Powerful Solution Against Climate Change, because in my opinion, I think this is kind of the most important step we can take to really start addressing this crisis. But my story starts with me showing up in Miami. This is actually the day I showed up. I'm holding one of our pets. And I'm pursuing my degree, my PhD in meteorology and physical oceanography, because I want to be a solution to climate change. And so this is the day I showed up in Miami. And when I got here, I kind of thought to myself, well, if I'm going to try to start talking the talk, I need to start walking the walk. And you'll probably notice that behind me is a gas guzzling SUV. And so one of the first things I did when I moved down here was my wife and I traded in our 2 cars and got one Prius that we share. That's led us to doing a lot more biking. I bike to school a lot. We've always used reusable bags, and we kind of took it to the next level with reusable straws and reusable produce bags, as I have there. So really trying to kind of eliminate our plastic. I became a vegetarian, which was easy because my wife was already a vegetarian. And so this was Thanksgiving one year where we don't have the changes in our lives to try to, live a greener footprint, including the fact that my research now is predominantly in oceanography to kind of contribute to what's happening in our climate and in our oceans. Despite doing all that, something was nagging me. After I kind of made all these changes, it felt like I was changing my life for the better and helping the planet. And the thing that was nagging me was this. No matter what I did, the CO2 in the atmosphere just continued to increase, and increase aggressively. And there wasn't really anything that, me kind of eating less meat or biking or riding my bike more was going to change about that. And in fact, there isn't anything that's actually really happened so far on our, policy-wise on our planet that's kind of changed that. This is annotated with all these different things that have happened, both good and bad, over the last, half century of things that, theoretically would make a difference, better or for worse. But the reality is that that curve just keeps moving up, and nothing has really altered that path of the fact that we keep pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's getting worse and worse, and it's accelerating. So that led me to this question. Why do we keep using fossil fuels? What's the reason for it? If we know it's bad for our planet, we know it's bad for our health, why do we keep doing it? The answer is really pretty simple. It's because they're cheap, right? If solar panels were cheaper than pulling oil out of the ground, for sure energy companies would make that transition, but they're not, right? So as long as they remain cheap, we're going to continue to use them. That's just the reality. There are ways that, we could certainly pass certain laws to restrict companies from using fossil fuels, but there will be this game where they're trying to kind of dodge those rules and continue to pull oil and gas out of the ground. And so what I'm going to talk about today is, yes, these are, they are cheap, but the point that's really important to understand is that they are artificially cheap. The cost that of pulling this oil and gas out of the ground does not include the cost that we all pay to society. Fossil fuel companies can pollute the atmosphere at no expense, but we all pay the cost in terms of smog and air pollution. health conditions, worsening asthma, worse storms and greater fires, and of course, sea level rise and flooding. And we all end up paying those costs, whether it's with our health or with our tax dollars. So it was at that point that I was really lucky to found an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. The Citizens Climate Lobby, I think, was kind of struggling over the same question that I was, where they're an environmental organization that kind of said, okay, we want to do what we can to help the planet to stop climate change. So that question that we need to answer is, how do we stop using fossil fuels? And so before Citizens Climate Lobby went ahead and said, okay, here's what we need to do. We need to, create a lot of solar panels or plant a lot of trees or whatever. They said to themselves, first, let's think about what is really important for a good climate solution. Like what do we need to have to accomplish the right type of policy to accomplish this major goal of reducing our fossil fuel use? And so they said, well, first off, the solution needs to be systemic. So so despite the individual changes that I'm making, by biking and eating vegetarian and so on, the reality is it's not changing. We need something that affects everybody, nationwide and worldwide. Secondly, it needs to be effective. We could certainly go and plant trees and that would be helpful, but is it driving the large scale change that we need to have happen to not only stop, putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, but also lead to drawdown, where we start bringing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere back down. It needs to be durable. And this one's really important because I feel like this is the one people don't think about enough. And so I say right there, it needs to withstand partisan politics. I'll use Obama's Clean Power Plan as an example. He put that piece of legislation into effect during his second term. And then when he left, what happened? Well, somebody who didn't agree with what he was doing came in and just dismantles it. And so now Obama's Clean Power Plan, hasn't been put into effect and probably won't be, just because of the whims of Congress and if it's red or blue. And so we need to have a solution that we can get both sides of the aisle on board with. And then finally, it needs to be fair. As soon as you say something like, okay, here's our solution, we're going to really put a lot of money into solar panels. Well, then you have people, in the wind turbine community, in the geoengineering community, obviously oil and gas and so on. And lots of people outside of that too, potentially saying, well, why aren't we chosen? As soon as you pick winners, you're also automatically picking losers. So what you need to do is come up with a solution that is fair for everyone. So what Citizens Climate Lobby came up with was this idea of a carbon fee and dividend. Yes, it's kind of short, people like to say carbon tax, but this is different. There are currently 8 policies in Congress that involve putting a price on carbon, but only I think 2 of them involve this type of thing called a carbon fee and dividend. So it starts out by putting a fee on fossil fuels at the source. So as it's pulled out of the ground, or it comes in through the port. So it's actually only a few thousand locations that we kind of like put this fee in place. As a result of that fee going into place, we put a fee on fossil fuels. The fossil fuel companies, of course, will end up passing some of those costs down to the consumer. So yes, the price of gas at the gas pump will go up. But that's why the second mechanism of this is so important, that we then take all that money that's collected and give it back, all of it, to the citizens equally. Every citizen gets the same amount and a half share for children, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But so to offset the increasing cost of goods that will end up happening, a little bit more at the gas station, and a little bit more for a number of different objects, it'll be fully refunded in this dividend. And then the last piece of the big piece of the idea was that it had to have a border adjustment. If we just put something like this in place in the United States, then obviously business here would say, well, I'm going to go move to another country where I don't have this fee. But with the border adjustment, when they try to kind of import anything back into the country, there will be a fee placed on it, as if they had already been in the country anyway. So there'd be no advantage for national organizations or companies to go global in that sense, in terms of their production. And so in particular, Citizens Climate Lobby endorses one bill that's in Congress right now called House Resolution 763, and it's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And so a little bit of details about it, because the details are really important with carbon pricing. I get questions where people say, well, carbon pricing didn't work here or there, and it's because of the details. And I can answer some questions about that more at the end in the notes. But a couple of important things with this bill. The price starts out at $15 per ton, which is about 13 cents per gallon of gas. And so you're probably saying to yourself, 13 cents per gallon of gas, like that's really going to solve the climate crisis? And the answer is no. But what we also don't want to do is suddenly say, let's put a price on carbon, and then you show up at the gas pump the next day and gas is $1 or $2 more. You know, we can't shock the system by immediately putting in a high price. Otherwise, there'll be revolts. You know, I mean, look at the stuff that's going on right now with coronavirus. Now, we have people on in every way of thinking, you know, for or against some of the policies that are happening in the United States right now. But a key is that while we start low, we increase pretty rapidly. We increase by either $10 or $15 per year. So let's say about 10 more cents of gas, or 10 more cents per gallon of gas. And that is based on an aggressive emissions reduction target. You know, simply if we are meeting our emissions reductions, it increases by another 10 each year. If we're not meeting like this aggressive emissions reduction target, then it increases by 15, you know, kind of accelerating the change that we need to have happen. And then each year when that money is collected, it's returned equally back to citizens. Each adult gets one share and each child under 18 gets half a share. So a family of 4 with 2 adults and 2 kids would get 3 shares. And one other important thing to this is that it will provide some regulatory certainty. So in other words, if after 10 years we are not meeting our reduction targets, so let's say every year we increase by $15 and still we're not meeting these reduction targets, there's a piece there's a writing in this bill, in this legislation, that empowers the EPA to make up the shortfall. So whatever we are short of that emissions reduction target, if we somehow don't end up hitting it in 10 years, and then we will continue beyond. But in 10 years, the EPA is then required to make up for what we've missed. And the most important thing behind this sort of idea, this Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, or even just carbon pricing with a dividend in general, is that it rewards citizens for reducing their carbon footprint. Right now, I'm trying to reduce my carbon footprint by riding my bike and so on. But the reality is most people aren't going to do that. If suddenly you're rewarded for the fact that, yeah, I'm going to get a more fuel efficient car or an electric car, and you're paying less money into gas every year, but still getting that dividend, you're coming out on top. You're coming out on the positive. You are making money off of this policy by changing your carbon footprint. So the reason, there are a lot of benefits to this bill, and so I'm going to go through a few of them. And so one of them is that it's good for the economy. Something that I get pushback about is any sort of thing that we put in any sort of like price on carbon or carbon tax would be restricted to the economy. It'll hurt the economy. But as long as we're putting money back in people's pockets, it won't be restricting the economy. In fact, it'll be driving the green economy that we know needs to happen. So right now we spend $240 billion a year in environmental and health harms of fossil fuels, and that is only increasing quite rapidly. And in the future, it'll create over 2 million jobs in the next 10 years, kind of driving that green economy. It'll be good for people in the sense that obviously right now we don't get paid a carbon dividend, but in the future you will get paid. And so that's an estimate, I think about 10 years down the road. I can't remember the exact year that was estimated for. But it's significant. You're not getting like a $13 check or something. It's kind of like a little stimulus package that families would get. It would be divided up by month, so you get the payment every month. But it's substantial. It's notable when you get a check every month for $300. And it's important to note, as I highlight down there at the bottom, that a number of studies have been done on this policy, and they all agree that the majority of citizens would gain more money through the dividend than they'd lose through increased costs. Predominantly, people who are working in middle class would gain more money than they lose. So this bill is progressive in that sense. Because people who are in middle and working classes have smaller houses, don't fly as much, don't, own multiple cars and that sort of thing, or cars beyond what they need. So the people who probably will pay a little bit more are the more affluent, but I mean, that's probably justified since in most cases they have bigger houses, fly more, maybe own lots of cars and so on. It's also good for people in terms of the environment and air pollution. We currently lose over 100,000 people every year in the United States to air pollution, and in the future it'll lead to saving hundreds of thousands of lives. And then finally, and probably most importantly, it's effective. This bill would reduce carbon emissions in the next 12 years by 40%, and it would be 90% by 2050. And I like kind of showing this graph because I think that this, hopefully drives home the point, especially for some of the maybe more science-oriented people in this group who like kind of seeing things as a visual and a graph and so on. And so you can see on here, we have the Clean Power Plan target near the top, that blue cross. And so that's Obama's Clean Power Plan target that, like we talked about, is being dismantled. But it's important to note that while that would have been a great thing to implement and keep in place, its purpose was really just to stop us from increasing our use, but not to actually kind of solve the problem of ramping down. You see our Paris Agreement value there. You see business as usual, which maybe you're surprised that's not increasing, but the reality is the green revolution is happening. People are putting solar panels on their house and so on, but it's not happening fast enough. So business as usual will basically keep us using the same amount of emissions moving into the future by the projections that were used in these studies. And then the two green lines there, the green dot and the green dash line, show the results of two models that were done, based on just implementing this one bill. And you can see that it falls in that gray area of what the IPCC says we would need to do in the United States to keep the planet under 2 degrees C. And you can see that enacting this bill would not only keep us below 2 degrees C, but kind of scraping that 1.5. And so this one bill would have the power to do that. So who supports this? You might be listening right now and being like, "What? Why is this a bigger deal?" If he says that this would really happen, this one bill would keep us well under 2 degrees C. Why aren't people like up in arms, fighting for this? And I mean, part of the reason is that I think people look at carbon pricing as something complicated that they don't really understand or want to understand. But another reason is just we still need to try to keep getting the word out. But the word is happening among some of the people that matter the most. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they don't endorse this particular bill, but they have said the #1 thing that we need to do to solve this crisis is put a high price on carbon. 27 Nobel Prize winning economists endorse essentially what this bill is. They endorse the idea of putting a price on carbon and returning all the money back to citizens, including, and other people that agree are all the living former US Federal Reserve chairs agree that this is the way to solve this problem. And many renowned climate scientists, and probably the three biggest you could think of if you know climate scientists, James Hansen, Michael Mann, and Catherine Hayhoe, all agree that this is how we should solve this problem. And in fact, this particular bill, the Energy Innovation Act and Carbon Dividend, has gained a lot of support across the country from local governments. And our local organization of Citizens Climate Lobby has been working really hard to make that happen. So we have endorsements from my city of Miami, the largest city in the country, to endorse this bill. City of South Miami, the first city in the country to endorse this bill. Key Biscayne, Surfside, Coconut Creek, and even the county of Palm Beach, the largest county in the country to endorse this bill. And this isn't necessarily just Florida centric. We have lots of endorsements, hundreds of endorsements from local governments nationwide. But obviously the South Florida is a pretty critical place to try to gain some momentum, since if we don't correct this problem, it could potentially disappear. And then finally, we also have 80 members of the House. This bill is only in the House, not in the Senate yet. It's just kind of, we're kind of trying to build momentum in the House. And so when we say it's a bipartisan solution, we're really walking a thin line there, because you see that we have 79 Democrats and 1 Republican, but that 1 Republican is the most important one. And we're working hard to kind of bring more Republicans on board. We're hopeful that maybe a group of them will step forward at some point in the near future. But it's worth noting that 1 Republican is also in essentially South Florida. It's Francis Rooney from Naples, or the district that's kind of on the west coast of Florida near Naples. So that just kind of gives you a broad overview of what this bill is about. And I'm going to kind of loop right back to what I started my presentation with, which was the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere and how it just increases no matter what we do, no matter what rules or what organizations or who's in office takes, takes place or happens, this keeps increasing, right? Well, there are a few places that implemented essentially this type of legislation. There have been some issues with some carbon pricing bills at different places in the country, in the world, and they just weren't implemented very well. But British Columbia is a part of the world that over a dozen years ago, about 15 years ago, put in place essentially what I'm advocating for right now. It's almost the exact same bill, and in fact, it's the bill that Canada is now kind of starting to implement nationwide because they looked at British Columbia and said, wow, this is so successful. This is how we need to solve this problem. And so I wanted to show this final graph where, like I said, about 15 years ago, British Columbia put into place a carbon fee and dividend, and their economy has been thriving while their greenhouse gas emissions has actually been going down. So the one thing that I've seen out there that actually can make us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is what I am, promoting right now. Putting a fee on fossil fuels and returning the money back to citizens. So if you'd like to learn more, there's a website right there, energyinnovationact.org, talks about the bill specifically. And then citizensclimatelobby.org is the organization that I'm involved in that advocates for this bill. But things that we really need people to do is just kind of engage your friends and community. As I said, I feel like this is something people aren't talking about enough. And we have all these crazy ideas with like geoengineering and putting mirrors in space. And we have a possibility for a solution right here that would be so easy and so simple that, I feel like needs a lot more attention. And then the third one I have on there is to contact your members of Congress. I've been advocating for a while now since I've gotten involved in this, and I go and I meet with the staffs and members of Congress in Washington, D.C. Regularly to advocate for this bill. I say that the biggest bang for your buck is in terms of like what you want to, when you want to accomplish something like with the environment, is to call your member of Congress. So there are 3 local members that are not on board right now. We have a number of other members that are on board. Frederica Wilson here in the Miami area. Alcee Hastings a little bit further north, like in the Delray area. Ted Deutsch up near Palm Beach, they're on board. But we have some other representatives that aren't. So one of the best things you can do is call your representative and ask them to join in supporting this bill. And if you go to that link, cclusa.org/call, it'll not only, you put in your address, it'll tell you who your members are, and it'll even give you a little like paragraph to say. If you're like, I don't know what I want to say, how do I kind of talk to this person or talk to their staff? Well, you could read it straight from the script if you want. It takes less than a minute to do, and honestly is like one of the most important things to do is have your member of Congress hear that people want this bill to happen. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'd love to take any questions, but thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'm going to jump over to, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'm just going to jump over to the questions, see if there's any in there. Okay, so the first thing was, do you think that reduced pollution due to coronavirus restrictions will help to support pushing this bill through? Yeah, it's well, so the coronavirus is something, I look at it as, when people are talking about and debating the coronavirus, I think to myself, like you think this is bad, we kind of like pushed off preparing for what's happening right now. We got the bigger kind of issue coming down the line. And so in that sense, like I hope that maybe people will see how we didn't prepare for the coronavirus well, and now we're not preparing for climate change. This question was about pollution in particular and how the reduced pollution could end up pushing this bill. Maybe I assume that's alluding to like all these things we've seen of like dolphins swimming in rivers that were polluted and that sort of stuff. And now that we've seen how the impact we have in the environment and when we stop, how much of a difference it makes, will that kind of drive this bill? It's a tough call. you know, I think it's still, people in Congress are so, you know, I mean, I guess I'll say like level-headed in the sense that, you know, they really weigh all the risks and benefits, and unfortunately, some of those risks and benefits involve, you know, them getting reelected and that sort of thing too. But you know, it could certainly factor into their thinking. So let's see, next thing, it's stated that the bill would reduce emissions by 90% by 2050, but scientists now urge that we are 100% renewable by 2030. How does this bill address that? Yes, that's a great question. So yeah, so this bill is, the idea behind this bill is that even though I just put up there this information that it'll keep us under 2 degrees C and even scraping close to that 1.5, by no means is it a cure-all. It's not like we kind of pass this bill and we all say, all right, we're good, you know, planet saved. The reality is there's a lot more we'll have to do. But if this bill can get us, you know, a huge portion of the way towards, you know, potentially 100% renewable energy by 2030, which it would change industry. It would make oil and gas say, you know what, if we keep doing this, we're either A, going out of business, or B, you know, it'll force us to adapt. And so those companies that adapt faster can kind of, you know, stop using their outdated infrastructure for oil and gas and start committing more and more to renewable energy. So it's not a cure-all, but hopefully it helps. Let's see. HR 763's regulatory adjustment clause limits the EPA's ability to issue some regulations of greenhouse gases. Can you explain why the specific clause is necessary or beneficial? It's a great question. Yeah, so this is something, if you go dig into the details of this bill, there is something there where right now, you know, the EPA is kind of trying to like ineffectively, you know, force or ineffectively kind of put together regulations on greenhouse gases that obviously aren't working. You know, that curve keeps increasing. So the idea is that instead of kind of like forcing all these regulations on one hand and then implementing this pricing of carbon in another, you know, let's put in this kind of like one big solution, and then kind of like let industry adapt, because there's going to be a big adaptation. You know, the idea isn't to, it's tough to just say to oil and gas, like, we're going to punish you as much as we can. And while I'm sure a lot of people would agree with that, you know, the reality is that we will get huge pushback from a group that has, you know, that's padding a lot of pockets of people in Congress, and that's a different issue. But if we don't give them at least some ability to adapt, and then, you know, it's kind of fighting our cause in the sense that, you know, we're creating potentially more harm in terms of something getting major legislation passed. So we still have in that bill the fact that we have to meet those aggressive reductions targets. So if those aren't happening, the price increases faster. And so it incentivizes those energy companies to make this switch quicker. If they just say, well, you know what, now the regulations are gone, you know, and I know this carbon pricing thing is happening, but we're going to pump as much into the atmosphere as we can. Well, all that's going to happen is they're going to drive up the price that we're increasing every year, you know, aggressively and drastically, so that they will kind of be their own worst enemy. So that's the reason the reason it's in there is just to try to give them the chance to adapt. But also, like I said, we need Republicans on board. And, you know, if Republicans have, well, people on both sides of the aisle get funded by the fossil fuels, but, you know, there certainly are potentially more Republicans. You know, if they're getting, you know, their pockets and their campaigns padded by the fossil fuel company, we're not very likely to get them on board. Let's see the next one. When was this bill introduced to the public? So it was originally introduced about a year and a half ago in kind of the lame duck session after the last election in 2018. And then it was reintroduced a little bit more than a year ago in February. So we've been gaining people, I mean, every month, you know, we slowly have been picking up more and more co-sponsors in the House. So it was introduced a little more than a year ago. What are my thoughts on the Green New Deal? I mean, I think the Green New Deal is great. And this bill can go hand in hand with the Green New Deal. You know, going back to what the other person asked about how would we get to 100% renewable by 2030, you know, this bill is not a cure-all, but in my opinion, this is like the most important first step we can take. And the Green New Deal, it's important people understand that while everything in the Green New Deal would be phenomenal to have happen, if we were to pass that, it wouldn't actually change anything. It's just kind of like a guideline of here are the things we want to have happen into the future. And And if we, but there's no kind of like guidelines as to how to accomplish this. This bill could be part of how to accomplish what we want to in the Green New Deal. Let's see, Mary Beth says, you addressed all the supporters of the bill, but I want to revisit your point on who is not supporting this and why. Okay, it seems like there are a lot of pros, so I'm interested in devil's advocate point of view. Perfect. I'm actually, my wife accuses me of being the devil's advocate all the time because I'm always, when I first heard about this bill, I was the devil's advocate. I kind of like grilled people that as Citizens Climate Lobby, being like, what about this? And I became convinced. Anyways, so the reason that we don't have more supporters, like for example, why isn't every Democrat on board? You know, we just, and somebody see Representative Shilley is coming up next. I don't know, but I'll see what the question is in a second. But the reason they're not on board is just the thing that somebody alluded to a moment ago. Well, there's a couple reasons. Number one is the thing that somebody alluded to a moment ago about how they're afraid of the perception of the fact that, you know, even though all it does is pause a few ineffective regulations that the EPA tries to, you know, enact, but, you know, obviously the EPA as a whole is kind of getting dismantled too. You know, even though it pauses a few of those regulations that really aren't doing anything, people in politics, you know, are concerned about their image. And so if they kind of, if, you know, all they need is some group, kind of some other environmental group coming along and kind of not looking at the big picture and saying, wait a second, you supported this bill that paused those greenhouse gas regulations, and then suddenly, you know, everything gets so twisted these days in terms of, you know, how people vote on bills. And there's so much in bills that you could probably pick any bill that a congressperson has voted for or against and be like against a part of it, but really maybe for the majority of what's happening. So that's rule number one, is just, or thing number one is just they are worried that, you know, just because of that little bit of regulatory pause, that, you know, that's something that will suddenly get people to think that they're not for the environment, because, you know, without seeing the big picture. A second reason is that people like, you know, Debbie Merkisel-Powell and Donna Shalala, you know, who are new to Congress, are just worried about, you know, doing this, but not letting other things happen in terms of like, you know, we need infrastructure and so on. So a lot of them think that we need to kind of take this bill and put in a lot more, you know, or they think that we shouldn't take the money and give it back to citizens. They think that we should take it and put it into green infrastructure, which again is great, but also, you know, we can do those things separately. And we have a problem in this country right now where 40% of Americans can't find $400 in an emergency. So if we're going to say, hey, we're going to increase the cost of everything on you, and then take that money and we're going to put it into the green revolution, because that's what we think should happen. And yes, we do think that should happen, but we can't do it while making, you know, everyday Americans suffer. And that will just make everyday Americans against this type of carbon pricing idea. So that's something else too, is people in Congress want to put more into it. And, you know, Citizens Climate Lobby, and I think other people in Congress who support the bill are trying to not do that, because we're starting to pick winners and losers now. And that's something that we don't want in this policy. So Representative Shalala says she doesn't support this bill because of amendments to the Clean Water Act, right? What does she mean by this? So it's just some of those regulations. The Clean Air, it doesn't touch any part of, and so this is important because this is one of these things that's like clickbaity, where, you know, Representative Shalala, you know, we've had a lot of discussions with, and I'm really happy with a lot of what she's doing for South Florida. But, you know, she kind of clung on to this idea that, you know, it like tears apart the Clean Air Act and that sort of thing. If you really dig into it, and I have, you know, the bill is there. If you go to energyinnovationact.org, you can go and read through the bill. You can see how thorough it is, but you could find the section on how the regulations change. And all it does is, all this bill pauses is just regulations about greenhouse gases that are ineffective. They can still be regulations involving carbon, involving methane, for any other reason: clean air, clean water, fuel emission standards, you know, pollutants, like anything you can think of, black carbon, that has any other effect, or can still be implemented and put into place for any other effect other than their greenhouse gas effect on the atmosphere. And in my opinion, that's okay, because right now, all those regulations clearly aren't doing anything. And we have an aggressive mitigation schedule that guarantees a reduction of 5% each year up for the first 50%, and then it's 2.5 after that. And again, I can get into the reasons why it goes from 5 to 2.5 is basically because some industries like airplanes will be a lot harder to change, into the future. But the reality is we could probably pretty drastically make a huge change right now in terms of just the energy we use, instead of using oil and gas, using clean energy, wind turbines and solar panels and so on. So we can reduce 5% every year pretty easily. And then it's that last, percent that we got to, like, more innovation needs to happen. But regardless, kind of moving capital in this way will help drive the innovation. Right now we're not incentivized to do it because it's cheaper to just use oil and gas. Okay, last one. Sorry, I know I get excited about this because I think it's just a great solution. Anyways, last one. How are you going to overcome the oil lobby? Right. Oil is critical to the maintenance of American-dominated world system or work system, maybe. Attempts to convert that to control of nuclear inputs failed in the past. How will America maintain its global dominant empire by current control of petroleum resources? What will you replace this key resource with so that you can be sold so that it can be sold materialistic and those who benefit? Okay, yeah, okay. A lot in there. So how do we overcome the oil lobby? The big thing is, believe it or not, I'm not going to say oil companies are for this type of regulation, but they're not even like that much against it. They are actually promoting another carbon pricing bill in Congress right now. There's part of that bill has there's some part of that bill though that would kind of free them of litigation in the future. So that's why I'm not for it. But that bill is actually almost the exact same as the one that I'm talking about here, except there's a little kind of like earmark in there that would save them from lawsuits into the future because of climate change. And that's not in our bill. Our bill, says, doesn't have anything in there about that. So litigation could still happen against the fossil fuel industry. But anyways, fossil fuel companies aren't as much against this as you would think, because number one, they realize that this is going to happen no matter what. Like, it's already happening. The transition is slower now because fossil fuels are cheaper, but obviously there's more solar panels out there than there were 10, 20, 30 years ago, more wind turbines and so on. It's already happening. And frankly, they realize that that's the future. And in some way, they kind of would like to get on board. Additionally, big industry and big companies hate kind of like the whims of like different Congresses. Now it's Republican, now it's Democrat. Now there's more regulations, now there's less regulations. When you're trying to plan an organization and a company out 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, but then have to adjust every other year because now the House is more Democrat than more Republican, it's pretty frustrating, and it kind of hampers your ability to kind of like really, like evolve your company as you feel like you should. Something like this, where we have in place like a clear pricing scheme, kind of moving forward and saying how much the price is going to be, they will know what's going to happen into the future, so they can adjust it appropriately. And then I missed I'm sorry. Oh, actually, it's dismissed. There were a few other things in there, but yeah, I guess I can answer more. You can always email me and I can answer more questions about it. I add my website up there, gregkoman.com, just my name, .com, and on there is my email address. And if you want to email me and ask me more specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I've already taken a lot of time answering these questions. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody being so engaged and asking these questions.
Greg, thank you. We love your passion. We love your passion.
Thanks.
So don't apologize for it.
Yeah, it's all good.
So yeah, today was really informative. I feel like now, the entire week we talked about sustainability, we talked about all these different aspects and how making transformative changes such as these are really important in order to achieve and maintain realistic goals with our warming scenarios. So super powerful. And thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. This was our last Eco Eat series. I hope everyone enjoyed them. So yeah, we have one last Earth Week event, and it is our Sip and Share. And so basically our Earth Week committee is going to act as sort of like a panelist, a panel where we're taking what you guys were doing and basically our DIY sustainability fails. So it's kind of like the memes where it's like the Pinterest nailed it, but our DIY fails. So come have some laughs and enjoy our final wrap up of Earth Week at our Sip and Share. So that's today at 7. But other than that, thank you everybody so much for, celebrating with us, and happy Earth Week.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kayla. Thanks for putting it together.
Bye, everyone. Stay positive.